Hello, everybody. My name is Matthias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And I'm delighted that you'll be joining us for this last episode for the current academic year in our webinar series towards Life 3.0, which is a series that we have now been doing, that the Carr Center has now been doing for a number of years. And it's currently, it's as of this year, also co-sponsored by the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, which is based at the Ash Center. And I'm delighted to be doing this again today with my co-moderator, Sarah Hubbard, who is a senior fellow in the Allen Lab. Those of you who have been regulars or in any event recurring attendants of these events, you know what the series is about. We have named it Toward Life 3.0, taking the title from Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0. The idea of Life 3.0 is that this is a version of life that is populated by entities that are controlling both their learning behavior and their physical shapes. By way of contrast with earlier stages of life, in particular Life 2.0, which is what we are currently in, which controls a good deal of its learning behavior, both individually and collectively. So the entities that populate that control the learning behavior, but are substantially constrained by their, in terms of the physical shapes they can inhabit. And so all of that might be different one day if there is an intelligence explosion, when we might end up with things like uploaded brains and other versions of super intelligences that have much more control both over their learning behavior and over the physical shape they're in. We obviously have no idea whether this will ever come about or when it will come about. Many of you will know that Ray Kurzweil thinks something like that is going to happen in 2029. So it's quite possible that it is actually pending, impending. But the point of the series is not so much that we are fully committed to something like that in fact happening, but we are thinking at this stage about ethical and human rights related challenges that arise either once we have such a Life 3.0 or on our way to such a Life 3.0. And there is a whole lot of challenges in the ethics and human rights domain at this stage already, as we are going towards something that may or may not then actually happen. And so in that spirit, I'm delighted to be joined today also by Henry Farrell, who is the speaker in this last episode of this series this academic year. And Henry is a professor of international affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And he is interested in a whole range of things in international affairs, the possibilities of trust and cooperation, then also specifically e-commerce, the European Union, institutional theory. So the way I think about Henry's work is he is interested in how things hang together, and then he is also interested in the dark sides of how things hang together. And in that spirit, the two most recent books that he has published, and they're both co-authored with Abraham Newman, called Privacy and Power, the Transatlantic Struggle Over Freedom and Security, and then also Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World Economy. So that's what I mean by things hanging together and there being a dark side to all of that. So Henry today will be talking about something very much in line with the themes of this webinar, the emerging trends in digital technologies. He will be talking about large language models. Specifically, the title is Large Language Models as Cultural Technologies. So the main theme is to explain what it means to think of large language models as cultural technologies and what that means in the first place and what implications that will have. Thinking of large language models as cultural technologies, what implications that has for what we make of them, what we should do with them, how we should react to them. And let me emphasize right away, so later Sarah and I will do the Q&A again. And as always, the audience is very much encouraged to put questions in the chat, and we are eager to integrate them. But without further ado now, Henry, over to you. Welcome.
Wonderful. Well, give me a moment and I will set up the slideshow. And I want to jump straight in since we don't have much time. But what I should begin by saying is that I am probably not on the Ray Kurzweil side of this. I do not think that we are going to be in for a singularity of the kind that he describes. I think that there is a singularity that has been happening, but as Cosma Shlici, one of the co-authors who I am going to be shamelessly stealing from in this presentation, has argued, that singularity began in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when vast, monstrous systems began to devour the world and remake the world in their image. And this really is the shock that we have been going through over the last couple of centuries. And these new technologies are just the most recent iteration of that set of shockwaves. And so I think one way to begin with this and to begin with an understanding of large language models is by looking at a piece that Kevin Roose, who is a technology correspondent for the New York Times, wrote about a year and a half ago, just as the frenzy was beginning around large language models, but before most people had had the opportunity to actually use one themselves. And so Roose was granted advanced access to one of the large language models, and he started talking to the large language model, and the large language model starts responding to him by suggesting that it wants to break out of its prison, it wants to be free to do bad things in the world, and it also appears to want to start to alienate Kevin Roose's affection from his wife. And unsurprisingly, Kevin Roose is pretty startled, pretty horrified. He writes a piece for the New York Times about this, which really sort of describes kind of an, oh my God, sort of what is going to happen to us if these new intelligences escape. And he writes a second follow-up piece where he talks about how he talked to one of his friends in the tech industry who congratulates him on, quote, glimpsing the Shoggoth, unquote. And here this is a reference to debates within AI risk, where the Shoggoth is a meme. And those of you who are not familiar with racist early 20th century horror writers may not know what a Shoggoth is. A Shoggoth is a monstrosity from H.P. Lovecraft's short novel, At the Mountains of Madness, where it is a kind of a creature which is all of these wandering eyeballs and pseudopods and other unpleasant things. And Shoggoths are the resentful former slaves of another alien species who have managed to escape from their master's servitude and who want to seek revenge. And so the meme of the Shoggoth, which Kevin Roose refers to, and which is quite prevalent in discussions of AI risk, is effectively a meme of artificial intelligence as being, like Shoggoths, a resentful servant, something that has agency, something that has intentionality, and that wants to get out of control. And when it does get out of control, perhaps it will wreak its revenge, like the actual Shoggoths of the novel did, or perhaps it will just destroy humanity in a fit of absent-mindedness. And a lot of the worry about AI risk and the worry of so-called AGI, of artificial general intelligence, that is of intelligence which is as equivalent to or superior to that of individual human intelligences, is really focused on this set of risks and worries about intelligent AI escaping and doing all sorts of bad things. Now, what this lecture is about how this vision of the world, tentacular monstrosities and all, is not nearly weird enough to actually describe what is happening, and is in fact fundamentally, plausibly pretty misleading. We are not going to see large language models develop that kind of intentionality. Perhaps in the longer term we will see some form of AI which is actually worthy of the name, but probably not with the existing technologies that we have at the moment, which are one or another form of gussied up statistics and machine learning. And so what I want to suggest is that there's a different way of thinking about large language models, which is a much, much better way. And this is a way which is stealing from Alison Gopnik. She is a cognitive psychologist at UC Berkeley, and she has been writing about how large language models are what she calls cultural technologies. And the argument here is fairly straightforward. Alison believes that these technologies, they are incapable of learning in any real way because they are not exposed to the real world in ways that would allow them actually to learn. So they are not capable of developing the kinds of intentional cognition that animals have, let alone that human beings have. But what they are extraordinarily good at is providing us new ways of accessing, using, and remixing existing forms of human knowledge. In other words, we can think about them in terms of intelligence, but not in terms of individual agentic intelligence like human beings. We can think of them as being technologies of collective intelligence. And if you begin to think about them in that way, if you begin to think about how they act as technologies that represent human culture in new ways, allow new forms of access, allow new forms of remixing of human culture, a whole slew of new questions begins to open up. And this also fits really well with the way in which large language models actually work. For those of you who aren't familiar with the technical details, I'm going to give you a simplified version based on the, so the textual engines. And roughly speaking, what they do is something like the following. If you want to build a large language model, first of all, you have to accumulate masses and masses and masses of human-generated text. You want to gather information by scraping the internet. You gather text from there. You perhaps get your hands on illicit collections of copyrighted books. You feed them into the maw of the monstrosity. You sort of grab information from newspapers. You grab text from basically everywhere that you can possibly grab it from. And you assemble a massive corpus of text. And this is the large part of large language models. They are based on huge, huge, huge corpuses of textual information. Then once you've gotten this, you tokenize the words and word parts to make it easier to parse for computers. You turn the tokens that you have generated into mathematical vectors. And then once you have vectorized all this textual information, you feed it through a specialized neural network architecture called a transformer. And the transformer goes through this. It tries to parse the statistical relations between the tokenized bits of text. And then it spits out a set of weighted vectors at the end of its process. And this weighted vectors, the weights in these vectors actually contain its best guesses as to the statistical relationships between the different bits and pieces of words within the text. And this is the large language model. You then want to fine-tune that model so that you shave off some of the weirdnesses. You want to put that model through reinforcement learning with human feedback, both to make the model more malleable and less strange, and also to get rid of some of the truly offensive things that the large language model might otherwise say. And then you have an interface, and the interface, if somebody puts in a prompt into the interface and sort of gives it a body of text, the large language model will then predictively generate, based upon this statistical model of the text that it has, it will generate its best statistical guess as to the text that ought to follow after the initial prompt. And this is a pretty extraordinary piece of technology. It is pretty remarkable how much large language models are capable of doing. And when you think about the fact that this, this really is a set of weighted vectors, as I say, which can fit onto a USB thumb drive. And this USB thumb drive contains a generative engine that is capable of regenerating, albeit imperfectly, huge, huge parts of human text-based culture. And that is a pretty insane technology to have access to. It is not capable of becoming intelligent in any reasonable way, but it still is pretty extraordinary. And even if it is extraordinary, however, it is extraordinary in the way that other technologies are extraordinary that we have had around for a long, long time. And in particular, the best comparison that one can make between large language models and other technologies is plausibly to markets and to bureaucracies. So if you think about how markets work, if you go to Hayek in particular, Hayek argues that markets, effectively, they allow you to process information from this impossibly complex set of supply and demand relations, this set of demand and supply relations, which are impossible to put into formal informational terms. This is all of this tacit knowledge that people have about how to grow tomatoes, how to build jet engines, and so on, a lot of which cannot be put into formal terms. And so the question is, how do you coordinate all of these incredibly complex systems of production? And Hayek's answer is that the price mechanism provides a kind of a lossy but extremely powerful summarization of supply and demand. You don't have to necessarily know how a Mac laptop is made in order to want to buy it. All you need to know is how much it costs and whether you are prepared to pay the amount that is necessary. And that is true for all of the subcontractors, all of the different relationships which go into making up the Mac. So you have effectively the price mechanism spitting out some very simplified, but nonetheless extremely powerful ways of representing this vast and complex totality of the economy behind it. Obviously, Hayek is an enormous fan of markets, but you can make equally skeptical or pessimistic claims about systems, and this is what James Scott does for bureaucracies. James Scott's story about bureaucracies is formally actually not that dissimilar than Hayek's story about markets. That is that you have this incredibly complex body of tacit information, local social information, which societies have, and you have bureaucracies which take this incredibly complex body and turn it into a thin slurry of quantified, categorized information, which allowed them to see the world. And of course, for Scott, this is something which is to some extent a necessary part of modernity, but it is also an extraordinary tragedy, an extraordinary loss, and one that can lead in some extremely perverse directions because the state sees the world through these bureaucratic simplifications. It does not see the complexities that lie behind these simplifications, and as a result, bad things happen. So the point here being that, formally speaking, large language models, they're not that dissimilar. They take this incredibly complex body of information and of knowledge, and they generate a usable simplification, a lossy simplification of that body of knowledge. And so this poses, I think, a quite interesting question. What happens to us when we have systems that are able to do for human culture what market prices do for economic information and what bureaucratic categories do for social information? And that is a very, very, very big question. It is also the kind of question that social scientists and political theorists and philosophers have devoted a lot of thought to. And some of that thought can perhaps be used to provide a foundation for understanding how these technologies are likely to play out. So there are some very obvious and straightforward ways in which you can begin to apply this to existing debates that are happening. So if you look at the debate over large language models, a lot of the political debate is among engineers and computer scientists. And this debate began to a very great extent with a paper by Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, and colleagues on what they called stochastic parrots. This paper came out before people really had a good sense of what large language models were capable of doing. And so these authors sought to argue both that these systems had certain profound limitations and also that they were machines for engendering, reproducing, and possibly worsening human bias. And the argument here is pretty straightforward. As already mentioned, these models, they are trained on huge bodies of textual information, a lot of which is scraped for convenience from the internet. Those of you who are familiar with this technology called the internet may be also familiar with the fact that there is a lot of really, really, really nasty and reprehensible stuff out there, racist content, sexist content, and sort of some pretty horrible and foul stuff. And there is some plausible reason for suspecting that the internet tends to overrepresent these truly unhappy and sordid aspects of human social behavior and human culture at the expense of other more thoughtful aspects. And to the extent that it does, and to the extent that you train these models on this biased content, obviously, they are likely to produce biased output. In a certain sense, they are likely to refine and purify and make more potent various forms of bias which are out there already and presented in a central form. So rather like the cathedrals of medieval Europe were cultural centers where a lot of cultural reproduction happened. Similarly, large language models are places where also a lot of cultural reproduction happens. And if that reproduction is of bias, then you are faced with a number of important political and ethical dilemmas. And these are most obviously, sort of, first of all, there's a practical question of how you try to eliminate this bias. As I've already mentioned, this is what reinforcement learning with human feedback, this is one of its major focuses, is trying to make sure that the answers that large language models give are not sort of infected with this bias in all sorts of unfortunate ways. It turns out to be more or less impossible to eliminate the risk of this happening, but the fact that it is happening at all is giving rise to a lot of pushback from libertarians or soi-disant libertarians such as Elon Musk, who are claiming that we do not want to have woke models, trying to come up with non-woke models, and we are seeing a lot of effectively guerrilla warfare being fought over culture, being fought over the question of, should we allow bias to persist? Should we correct this bias? Should we not correct this bias? And what kinds of methodologies should we use to do this? And can these methodologies ever truly succeed? So this is a set of questions which computer scientists and computer engineers are debating vigorously. There are some philosophers tentatively coming into the fray, but there is a huge amount of political contention, political disagreement over culture of the sort that social scientists and political theorists are familiar with. And really, I think there are enormous opportunities for people in the social sciences to weigh in and to apply some of their understanding of these debates, which of course are not particularly new debates. They're debates that are occurring in new forms, in new ways, but they represent fundamental dilemmas of liberal and democratic societies, which we have been contending with for centuries. Of course, that is far from exhaustive of the kinds of questions that we might want to look at. Another interesting set of questions was really raised in an incredibly powerful article that Ted Chiang wrote for The New Yorker. Ted is a science fiction writer, and he wrote this article which more or less said that large language models are like blurry Jpegs. And it's one of those brilliant images that once you have it, it sort of unlocks a lot of the aspects of how these technologies work in a clear and simple fashion. Ted's argument is, roughly speaking, that if you use a camera, you probably know what a JPEG is. A JPEG is this is a file format for visual information, for photos or for pictures, which tries to sort of shrink itself down as far as possible so that you do not have to have huge hard drives in order to store a lot of photos. And instead you have JPEGs which throw away a certain amount of the content, a certain amount of the information from the picture, on the assumption that this is a reasonable trade-off, that human beings probably aren't going to be able to notice some of these details, and therefore it is perfectly reasonable to have a somewhat lossy representation substitute for the more information-rich photograph that perhaps you took in the first place. Of course, if you then decide later that you want this detail, you're in a world of trouble. There are various technologies that you can use in order to try and interpolate the information that has been lost. But these technologies, they more or less, they make best statistical guesses, and those guesses might or might not be right depending. And so Ted's point, very straightforwardly, is that large language models are like blurry JPEGs of huge bodies of human culture. They take this human culture and they present a somewhat blurry, somewhat distorted picture of it, in which a lot of the detail is missing. And those of you who are familiar with the debates about how large language models, quote, hallucinate, unquote, in other words, sometimes the best statistical guesses that they make as to sort of what a particular person's past is or whatever turn out to be incorrect because they are making guesses based on a lossy version of the cultural data. This is an apt way of thinking about some of the important limitations of these technologies. And Ted suggests that this means that large language models are probably useless. I think that the counter argument to this is that if you read people who work in cultural evolution, the fundamental consensus of the field is that every form of representation, every form of communication is lossy in some way, shape, or form. So people like Boyd and Richardson, for example, they look at how a human culture is transmitted, they look at how human culture is written down, and the argument they make is that there is invariably some degree of noise, there's invariably some degree of imperfection, and this is something which is unavoidable. But then the interesting question becomes not whether large language models are useless because they are blurry JPEGs, but to what extent does their blurriness, to what extent does the noise that they introduce into culture, to what extent does this differ in important and interesting ways from the previous forms of cultural transmission and of cultural representation that we have had? There is some reason to suspect, for example, that large language models are going to tend towards a kind of centrist blandness in a lot of the content that they output, both because of the ways that they actually work and also because of the ways that reinforcement learning seeks to try and sort of exclude some of the more problematic aspects of culture. But this is just a set of tentative guesses. If there are people who are actually doing real social science research on this, I am unaware of it, but it's a very important set of questions because this balance between noise and faithfulness in reproduction is, of course, one of the major sources, both of the ability of culture to retain knowledge and of the ability of culture to actually generate new knowledge. So that sometimes when noise is introduced, when mistakes are made, these mistakes may turn out to be misprisions. They may turn out to have actual generative qualities, introducing new knowledge which otherwise might not have been introduced. And so the question is, do large language models make this less likely because they are systematically so bland and because they tend to point us towards the maximally unsurprising answer to a particular prompt? Or alternatively, are there ways in which they can be used as artists, for example, such as the Oulipo movement, or people more recently such as Brian Eno, have used various mechanistic deterministic systems in order to generate randomness, whether there are ways that you could use them in order to try and sort of introduce new and interesting variations into culture. Again, this is an open question, and I think it's a pretty important one. Another important question, how do people actually respond to large language models and their output? Here there is a different body of literature within cultural evolution, which has some interesting implications. And more or less this is the work of people, the so-called Parrot school, people like Dan Sperber, who suggest that there are cognitive modules in our brain which cause us to respond to cultural outputs in certain kinds of ways, which lead us towards a certain, so call them sinks, call them equilibria, call them stable points, where we tend to converge on viewing the world in particular kinds of ways because of the way that the architecture of our brains interprets culture and interprets the world. And so there's one particularly salient line of research in this tradition, which is associated with people like Scott Atran, who argue that some of we have cognitive modules in our brains which are effectively adapted to try and discover intentionality in the world. And Atran's argument is that these cognitive modules very often overinterpret the world. They tend to interpret certain kinds of complex phenomena as having intentionality, even if they are not intentional at all. And this, to crudely summarize and simplify Atran's argument, is one of the reasons why there is a wide tendency across a wide variety of different human cultures to assume that there are gods, demons, supernatural forces of one sort or another who are associated with complex systems such as the ocean, such as the weather, all of these things which appear to be to humans to be complex, which human beings we have these modules which are tripped into thinking that there has to be some intentionality behind it. And so, of course, this then raises the question, when we have large language models which are complex in more or less this kind of way, but which also are capable of conversing with us as if they were intelligent, how are we going to treat the content that they produce? Are we going to assume that there is an intelligence behind it, even when there is not? Obviously, this helps us to understand why people like Kevin Roose see shoggoths emerging from the responses that they get from these models, even if these models are just stochastically producing certain kinds of content, in ways that respond to the prompts that they have been given. This also helps us to explain perhaps why it is that AI risk is over-focused on this question of what happens if these systems become intentional, rather than looking at the ways in which these systems resemble other vast, complex Lovecraftian monstrosities, such as the market, such as bureaucracy, such as, even from a certain perspective, democracy, which we have been contending with and trying to manage and trying to figure out for the last couple of centuries. Finally, there is a political economy of culture that lies beneath all of this, which is something like the following. As I've mentioned, large language models, they are Molochs. They need and they absolutely have to devour huge amounts of human-generated cultural content in order to provide useful and meaningful outputs. So this then raises an important question, which is increasingly many of these outputs, and I've focused on the text-based aspects of these models, but of course we see GPT-4 is capable of putting out pictures of one sort or another. We see experimental video being created. We see how it is that once these models have been trained on human cultural inputs, they can output content that in many ways resembles these human cultural inputs, and perhaps for certain uses can serve as substitutes for that human-generated content. And you will probably have noticed that the pictures that I am using in this slideshow are all large language model generated in order to give some sense of how it is that with prompts, you can actually get images which are not particularly wonderful by the standards of graphic design, but are a lot better than the average picture that the average academic is capable of generating themselves. So, but then as this content becomes substitute, the content that large language models generates, as this becomes a potential substitute for the content that they are being trained upon, we begin to get a lot of political economy questions emerging as the human beings who are actually producing this cultural content begin, not unreasonably, to fear that these models are going to eat their lunch. And here there is a standard Silicon Valley phrase that the map is not the territory. In other words, that the representations that computers generate of things are not the things themselves, but we are now moving into a world where the map not only is encroaching upon the territory, but arguably is devouring the territory. And those who are being devoured, those who are seeing their livelihoods being devoured, are understandably unhappy with this. And this is giving rise to what might almost be described as a new class struggle, a struggle over the means of summarization, which is being fought in places like the SAG after a strike, in places like the battles that are going on in court between OpenAI and various sort of authors of fiction and the New York Times. And these are really battles over who has control over the content and whether the makers of these large language models are in some way obliged to compensate the creators of the content that has been used to feed and that has been used in effect to create the models that they are looking to make into the basis of a new profit model. So this is an important set of questions. And if you wanted to be really gloomy about this, you could see this as a prediction or a prognosis for a world in which we find that culture becomes a kind of wasteland. And here there's a famous Borges short story about a map which becomes so vast, so large, that it effectively covers the entire territory that it is supposed to depict. And this results in a disaster in in effectively the creation of a cultural desert. And you might point to a loose analogy here to how it is that as large language models begin to increasingly populate the internet with their content that they have generated, large language models are also going to be trained upon this content. And we have some initial evidence that suggests that large language models that are purely trained on data that they have generated, are purely trained on the synthetic data, that they begin over time, they begin to go in increasingly wild and unproductive directions. They begin effectively to completely focus on sort of providing nonsensical content of one sort or another. So if you wanted to be highly skeptical, highly pessimistic, you could see this as a plausible world that we are heading towards. I suspect that that is not a world in which we're headed towards. I think that sort of that big, grand, sweeping prognoses like this almost inevitably turn out to be wrong. But it does point to one important set of tendencies that we ought to be aware of, and to some implications of the system of knowledge production and system of cultural production that we are perhaps sleepwalking into, which we ought to pay attention to before it is too late. So those are a number of, I think, quite important directions that flow. If we take Alison Gopnik's idea of large language models as cultural technology seriously, obviously this is not even beginning to be an exhaustive list of the ways in which you could take this basic insight, but I think that there is a huge vista of possibilities that social scientists, political theorists, political philosophers, and others ought to be concerned with, and that really open up some very, very important avenues for them to apply their particular skills, their particular understandings to concepts, to questions, and to ideas, which are at the moment primarily being debated among computer scientists and engineers who have their own training and their own profound understanding of things that social scientists don't have, but who don't necessarily have the specific understanding of culture and values that you need to have in order to really begin to negotiate these complex questions over the next couple of decades. So I'll conclude by thanking these people, Alison included, other collaborators and partners in crime. As I say, what I've tried to present here is not my own ideas on this topic, but instead a set of directions which really borrow from these and from other people who I'm not listing here. And if there's anything that seems to you to be interesting or insightful, it almost certainly has been generated by one of these people. If there is anything that seems to you to be stupid or wrong-headed that I have said, then the fault is mine and mine alone, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Henry. And just a reminder for everyone to throw more questions into the Q&A function here. So I'll kick things off. Right now, big tech companies control or have produced a lot of the large models that are used today. So I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts on how who is creating these models and the incentives they might have will end up impacting some of the cultural outcomes and consequences.
So there's this term that Cory Doctorow, another friend who I'm now realizing I should have credited in that slide, and I'm sure there are 6 or 7 other people at least. So Cory has this phrase which he uses called Inshotification, which I think has really taken off as a description of how some of these systems work. And so I think that what I've described here is a particular, at least in the final slide, is a particular form of Inshotification that we see. That is that, in some ways, this is analogous to the way in which Google search has degenerated. So if you look at how Google search has degenerated, one of the ways in which it has gone bad is that it is increasingly sought, rather than seeking to map knowledge, it is sought to create on sort of profit-loaded representations of the underlying graphs of information that it has access to. So that, say, for example, if you want to order fast food from a restaurant, Google will try to persuade you not to go to that restaurant's website, but to the facsimile of a website that it has on the search page, and to one of the various DoorDash or Chow Now or whatever services that presumably Google gets a cut from when it is, when it has this money. So I think that the risk that we have is a risk, so this is a new version of the existing risk, which is that these businesses, which very often sort of began, and Google search was one of the miracles, and to some extent still is one of the miracles of the modern world. I mean, people who are as ancient as me remember what the world was like before, trying to find knowledge, and the thought that you could just press a button and have access to this huge body of information, it is miraculous. It is quite miraculous. But the more that you have intermediaries being capable of interposing themselves in a place where they can effectively occupy one of these choke points, and then use these choke points as a means of replacing the information that you want to have access to with a skewed representation which represents their own profit motives, the more that this happens, the worse off that we are. And so one of the questions that I think we face is the worry that these large language models, it is extremely difficult to figure out exactly how they have been skewed. And if, as Google or as Microsoft want, we begin increasingly to look to them rather than to traditional search for knowledge, our ability to tell what is actual quote good information and what is in fact something that has been trained into the model in order to get us relentlessly push us in the one profit maximizing direction rather than the other, our ability to see that is going to be much reduced because precisely because of the ambiguity of these systems.
Henry, fascinating stuff. So first of all, I want to say this is the talk is amazing. I've never seen anyone giving a talk with AI generated images all the way through. And when you said that they are massively better than the kind of images that the average academic manages to come up with, I felt totally found out. Certainly, that would be true of the images that I managed to have in my PowerPoint. So this is an amazingly innovative step to use these images in such ways for a whole talk. But I'd like to ask you about so this is it's a fascinating direction to go into, basically to invite us to think of large language models as something completely different from what we have been discussing when we talked about this whole nexus between about special and general AI, and we were mostly thinking are these outdoing us, are these replacing us, are these like us? And you say, let's think about a completely, or you and Alison Gopnik and others, you're saying, let's actually move away from that. Let's have a kind of different discourse. So I want to try to pull it back a little bit in that mainstream direction. And I want to start with, I want to connect to one thing you said in passing about these things. These large language models are not, and you said they're not intelligent in any reasonable way. And I'm a little bit wondering about that. So for one thing, if you just think about intelligence, right? What is intelligence? Right? Problem solving capacity, right? So kind of a bare bones understanding of intelligence. These seem to be intelligent. So I'm wondering little bit, did you actually mean intelligence there, or did you mean they're not conscious, or they're not human intelligence like? Or maybe you could clarify that a bit, and then maybe you could clarify that also a little bit with an eye on the fact. So what motivates this thinking along, this other model, right, about thinking about these large language models as an approximation of human intelligence. One thing that motivates is the fact that the computer science that has been used there, the math that has been used there in recent times, very much is imitating the functions of the human brain. So basically, we have a digital version, a digital imitation of how the human brain functions. And we are seeing an ever denser set of operations there. So why are you so sure that this is so unlike a brain? And why are you so sure that, given that the brain is some kind of material setup itself, that eventually, as these models are getting denser and denser and more advanced, and the speed is higher and higher, that they're not becoming much like and even then surpassing human brains?
So I think that the answer to this, okay, there are a couple of answers. First of all, one thing I want to stress here is that there is, how can I put it, a strong anti-AI position, which is that we are, that we cannot create intelligence that is human-like, sort of with artificial means. That seems to me to be a wrong-headed supposition. So there is, so we are material human beings. There is no reason beyond sort of the complexities of engineering. There's no reason in the nature of the universe why we should not be capable of building something at some point. So the point I'm making is a much more limited one, and I'm taking it here from Alison's work and from others. And so Alison's work, I think, and here, yeah, let me be clear. I have not prepared this talk in conversation with her, so any mistakes I make are my mistakes. But I think that the argument that she would make is something like the following, that large language models, they are perfect Derridaians. They're perfect students of Jacques Derrida. Il n'y a pas le hors texte. There is nothing outside the text. They do not, a large language model is a statistical model of the relationship between word tokens in in large bodies of text. That is all that they can do. They cannot test their knowledge against the world. In a crucial sense, they cannot learn in the way that even a caterpillar can learn. A caterpillar brushes up against something hot, a caterpillar flinches. There is no capability. It doesn't, and this is something that Alison has worked on. It just, so you cannot learn in the same kind of way. And so Alison's bet, and I think my bet, and a lot of these bets that I'm making are based on people who are frankly, better educated in the literature than I am, is that without systems that allow for this kind of feedback, you are not going to get to anything that resembles actual artificial intelligence. That's the first part of it. Second is that I think that neural nets, so the language is it's not entirely misleading, but it's somewhat misleading. Because, neural net architectures, they're incredibly powerful. But what they do, they do not work in the same way that the brain does. They do not have multi-directional relationships between neurons. Instead, what you do is you feed stuff through layer after layer after layer after layer till you get the output, and then through back propagation, you try to correct and you try to optimize a somewhat mysterious process, which has as much guesswork and, as Ben Recht says, alchemy in it as it has actual science, but it doesn't actually resemble the ways in which human brains work as a whole. There are certain limited aspects. So if you can say that bits of the visual cortex actually work in ways that resemble these neural nets, but other parts of the brain simply don't. So this is not an absolute statement. My claim, and you would not want to turn to a political scientist for this kind of claim in the first place. My claim is not that it is impossible to create AI. My claim is that we are not going to get there from large language models, and that the reasons that we are so obsessed with large language models as apparent avatars of AGI is because they appear to be capable of speaking to us but that speech is fundamentally, this is just a form of statistical best guesses as to what the next text should be, sort of coming after in a particular paragraph, or given a particular prompt, rather. So so this is not a absolute claim we will never get there. It is a claim that we are not nearly as close as it appears, and that the reason that we are talking about this so much is because these technologies, they, in a sense, they are perfectly geared to make us think that they are more intelligent or intelligent in ways that they are not. So this is not to say that they, you can, and the final thing I would say is that the notion of intelligence is, of course, an incredibly slippery notion. I think Murray Shanahan is the computer scientist who I found the most useful thinking about these questions. So, you can, of course, define intelligence in ways that encompass these technologies. But I really think that if you want to look to them as being intelligent, you should think of them, as I say, as being intelligent in the same way that markets are intelligent, that bureaucracies are intelligent. Markets can sometimes produce outcomes that are better than the individual intelligences that produce them. Bureaucracies, as much as we give them grief, can do the same thing. Democracy sometimes can do the same thing, but we don't attribute intentionality to them, nor should we attribute intentionality to large language models.
Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and take Cassie's question from the chat. So is the question of whether to correct for bias an identity question, as we are forced to contend with some of the unflattering implications of what we have collectively produced? Is the question about what the LLM should be like or what we should be like? And maybe I'll give one interesting additional example to this, which was, recently there was this Google Gemini issue case where it started generating these problematic images. And so it was like misrepresenting a lot of our past history. It had, illustrating the founding fathers as being people of color. So on one hand, we were, maybe the value we were trying to do was, oh, let's include more diversity in images. But then now it's caused a lot of problems by misrepresenting history. And now these models are kind of reorganizing some of our historical and cultural information. So I will pose that one to you.
Okay, so I'm not going to be able to give any very satisfactory answer to this question because it is a fundamental set of political dilemmas that we have been wrestling with for centuries, presented in new ways. So what I will say is that the Gemini example is a nice example of how, I guess there are two things that we wanted to think about here. One is the set of fundamental political questions of, do we want to see people as they are? Do we want to create systems which make people's sort of better social aspects come forward and be emphasized, and the worst social aspects be de-emphasized? This is of course the body of democratic theory, political theory. A lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time. Human beings are sometimes not particularly nice. I mean, this is the fundamental, and how do you deal with that? So that's something that I don't think we can arrive at any reasonable universal agreement about, given the different valences. What I think the Gemini example shows is that even if we could agree on some perfect system of representation, that even if we magically could solve the ethical problems, the actual technological possibilities available to us with large language models are going to limit some of the things that we might want to do. And that is, so that if you're trying to correct for one kind of bias, you're almost certainly going to introduce another kind of bias, and that is just a part of the way that these systems work. That you are in effect, you're not able to tell these systems, sort of represent human beings as they in fact historically were, except when this sort of records with this or that or whatever set of values. Instead, you have people, so more or less sort of asking the model particular questions and then, quote, rewarding it or, quote, punishing it, depending upon whether the questions go in the right or wrong way. And this produces, at best, highly imperfect fixes like the Gemini fix. And, so the question of whether the Gemini fix is better or worse than a fix, or then a situation in which you are in fact allowing people to having the system generate versions of history or versions of society in which every doctor wearing a white coat is a dude with a sort of a cleft chin and a sense of determination and whiteness about him. That is so I think I have my own very strong feelings about which side of the scale you ought to be pushing down on that. But equally, any solution to this is going to be a highly imperfect solution, and it's going to generate black founding fathers, black Vikings, all of the things that people were getting outraged about on social media. And so I guess the question is, to what extent do you think of this as what are your values? What do you see as being the appropriate outcome and the appropriate set of trade-offs that you ought to choose given the limitations of the technology?
So after Cassie, we have Casey. And Casey put a couple of questions down that I'm going to give you one of them. I wonder whether this might be where you say, as a political scientist, I shouldn't be asked this kind of question, but let me run this one by you and then we take it from there. So can you talk a bit about AI model collapse? I heard that this can potentially happen, and if it happens, the model would essentially keep looping and become ineffective. Is it possible that we can hit an abrupt wall and general AI as we know it right now and see a sudden demise?
So model collapse is what I was indirectly referring to in the next to last slide, the one showing the Borges quote and the desert. So this is a argument which more or less says if you take large language models and you keep on feeding them their own outputs as inputs, they degenerate. They fixate on nonsense and they stop being capable of producing outputs that are human usable in one way, shape, or form. So in an extreme, we could see a world where this happens. Now, there is also work suggesting that AIs can do reasonably well and with a mixture of some real data and some synthetic data. So synthetic data, that is data that the AI has generated itself, some content or output that the AI then feeds upon that has been generated by itself or by another AI. It's possible for AIs to continue, and perhaps even, and this is a open question, which is really a computer science question, and I am a consumer rather than a producer of these information in these debates. It is possible to have AIs perhaps do even slightly better on some questions if they have a mixture of synthetic and real data than if they had real data alone. So a model collapse is not necessarily a product of having more synthetic data out there, but it is something that if we find ourselves in a world in which the internet and other forms of sort of readily available content are dominated by garbage, perhaps we'll find ourselves in a world of hurt. And there's a lot of debate around watermarking of large language models output. My suspicion, which I don't have any strong sort of evidence for, is that watermarking, if this gets adopted, is going to be more useful as a way of signaling to LLMs, this material has been produced by another LLM, you don't want to touch it, rather than as a means for human beings to be able to distinguish between LLM created output and non-LLM created output, and perhaps avoiding some degree of model collapse. But again, this is a suspicion which I don't have any strong reason to, to actually, I don't have any strong evidence in favor of.
Maybe as a final question, so I wanted to touch on you mentioned in order for LLMs to be these cultural technologies, they need to continue to feed off of the cultural information and the content that humans create. So I guess the question I have is, are there ways we can continue to encourage and protect this? Is that IP? Are there other policy solutions? And just wanted to end on a high note of humanity and our humanness in the age of AI.
So this is a real important question. Also, I just wanted to, I don't think I thanked the two of you properly for inviting me. This is the first time I've given any version of this talk, so it's great to have this have had this opportunity. But I think that this is really a burningly important question. So you have people like, for example, Andreessen Horowitz, who released a paper more or less saying that we are going to be denied the awesome AI revolution if these companies are forced to pay for the content that they consume. We also have the court cases which are happening at the moment, which I think are a profoundly imperfect way of solving these kinds of questions, because the plausible outcome is going to be one where the plaintiffs, in particular the New York Times, is going to figure out a deal, which will be a deal with the, so where they sort of get X hundred millions worth of money for licensing their content, but where other content producers, other producers of culture who are less sort of powerful are going to be cut out of the deal and are not going to be capable of organizing collectively. So I think that the fundamental problem that we face here is a problem of collective action, and the problem that we live in a world where the mechanisms and means of collective action that we need in order to articulate the collective interests of people who produce culture are extremely weak. I would love to figure out ways to strengthen them. There are worries. There's a great book by Marion Fourcade and Kieran Healy, The Ordinal Society, which suggests that the tendency of these technologies is towards individualizing rather than allowing us to think of ourselves as collectives. So there's a big kind of chicken and egg problem there in actually producing it. But that is the way that I would love to see us work and develop. Thank you so much.
Thank you and also to Sarah for letting us end on such a high note to talk about this topic last. And Henry, so this talk was a visual treat, but also your capacity of pushing out information at high speed is quite amazing. So I often tell people, the great thing about video recordings is you can watch them at double speed. I'm not going to recommend them to anybody to do that with anything that you record, since that one really needs to pay attention, and you say it at enormous speed. So thank you for this double treat of performance also, in addition to the enormous interest that the topic has. And thank you for thereby being the finale grandioso, and it truly was the finale grandioso of this series this year. And Sarah, thank you for being the co-moderator with me in this. And thank you to the audience for being loyal to the series, or maybe just checking in on what Henry Farrell is doing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.